Until 13 months ago, I had spent my entire adult life in the military. I was a strategist, and when I retired from the Army, I thought I had used these skills to prepare for the transition, and it still punched me in the throat. I feared being invisible, of having everything I'd ever worked for forgotten. But since I've retired, I've discovered there's a big difference between invisibility and anonymity. Invisibility erases without a trace. I would no longer matter or have meaning. Anonymity, on the other hand, does not erase who you are. It reveals who you are. Anonymity, the purposeful sublimating of one's identity, is, in fact, the final test of a leader. Since I've retired, I've discovered and understood that being willing to move in and out of anonymity may be one of the most courageous and professionally generous things I will ever do. I spent 31 years in uniform, but I'm not the first woman in my family to serve in the military. My grandmother served in the United States Navy in World War I, and this is her identification badge. She achieved the rank of Yeomanette First Class. Before her service in World War I, she was a secretary to Theodore Roosevelt during his Bull Moose campaign. Teddy Roosevelt brought that message here to the Hudson Opera House in 1914. After he spoke from this stage a century ago, it's likely that my grandmother signed his name to his letter of thanks for the invitation. She was 17 years old, and signing his name to letters was her job in his office. After my grandmother's adventures with Teddy Roosevelt and with the United States Navy, she married and became a mother and a housewife. And she became invisible to the world she once dazzled. When I was a child, I equated invisibility with being denied dignity and meaning, and I decided I would never let that happen to me. We moved around all the time when I was a child, and I was always looking for a place to call my own. I wanted respect and meaning and stability, and I decided that I would get this by making sure that I was visible and by having my name known. 3 days after graduating from high school in Poughkeepsie, I entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, which had graduated its first class with women 2 years before. This is me on the far left, on my very first day of West Point, known as Reception Day. This is the beginning of an abrupt transition from civilian to soldier. You can tell that it's still very early in the day because the men have not been to the barber and because some of us are still smiling. On that first day, I learned to march and I learned to salute. I learned basic military courtesy, to salute anyone with a stripe down his or her trouser leg, the uniform distinction of an officer. Immediately upon receiving these instructions, though, the very first person I saw with a stripe down his trouser leg was the postman. And I saluted. Want to be visible and known? Salute the postman on your first day at West Point. So I was visible and I was known, but not according to my plan. I was on stage and I had no idea what my lines were. But I learned my lines and even wrote some of my own over the next 3 decades. Despite that traumatic first day and despite that hair, I graduated from West Point and I began my service as an officer. And I loved the Army. I had leaders who encouraged me to be authentic and to grow as a leader. I found steadiness in the culture of accountability, which allowed me to lead and inspire without manipulation. I fell short as a leader many times, but I knew and held as truth that leaders don't develop followers, they develop other leaders. I asked the men and women I led to give me everything they had, and they gave it over and over. And then it was my turn to give them the future that they had worked and prepared for. And this meant I had to give them the stage. And this was hard. I had to surrender the stage when I had finally learned my lines and when I had grown accustomed to the applause. But I think this may be one of the things that MacArthur meant when he said that old soldiers don't die, they just fade away. And as I became a more senior leader, I began to appreciate this role of fading away, of stepping into anonymity. In fact, I think that visibility and anonymity are part of the same leadership dynamic. The Army moves you around all the time. Leaders practice transitions. At the beginning, you step up and you are visible. And at the end, you need to be willing to let go and step off the stage. And this is acknowledged by military ceremony. In a change of command ceremony, the old commander surrenders the unit flag to the new commander. These are crossroads for a leader. This is me with my unit flag as an artillery battery commander, passing in review during a parade. In a 27-year career as an officer, this was my favorite job. When it came time for me to surrender my battery, it was to an officer who looked as if he was 15 years old. But I would have had a hard time surrendering my unit flag to MacArthur himself. But Army custom, as well as ceremony, builds a few things into the equation so that no one has to witness that awkward spectacle of an Army captain running off the parade field with her unit flag, refusing to surrender it. The first is that every person is replaceable. Not to our family and friends, not to those who love us, but to the units we lead. Because something could happen to me, I must prepare the men and women of my unit to sustain a transition and thrive under a new leader. This is an element of selfless service. The second is that leaders are expected to fade away, whether or not it's labeled as such. But because there were always new vistas ahead, I never feared becoming invisible in the process. I stepped off the stage into anonymity about a dozen times in my Army career. But each time I had a new job to challenge and distract me until I retired. And even without the distraction of a new assignment, I still had to surrender the stage. I still had to give this to those I led, and I gave it. I gave until it hurt, because I was giving away what fed my ego. Now, ego is one of these things that's a good servant and a terrible master. Ego had propelled me to reach for opportunities and adventures and dreams that often enough came true. But the way you lead tells the story of your values. I wanted to be a leader who helped create pathways to the American dream through service. I had to surrender parts of my ego to do this. And this is why I see anonymity as this last test of a leader. Because those who come behind me can only fully realize their dreams if I fade away. This was taken 4 days before my retirement ceremony. It was in this last transition that I was forced to confront those adolescent ideas I had about invisibility and meaning. And what I've discovered is that it was in each of the transitions of my career that I learned crucial things that made me the person that I am and the leader I am. It was in these periods of anonymity that I developed self-awareness. It was in surrendering pieces of my ego that I opened up room to grow. In every transition, I had put my legacy, my work, my ego into the hands of capable, outstanding new leaders. Throughout my career, I yielded the stage. I practiced unclenching the fist in which I held my professional identity. And this time around, viewing that anonymity through the lens of leadership enabled me to understand that I have the ability and the strength to move forward. This is my grandmother and me, and it was taken during my plebe year at West Point. I stand before you today shaped in large part by the ferocity of my grandmother's pride, of her pride in her support for the progressive platform Teddy Roosevelt shared in this building a century ago, of her pride in her naval service before women even had the right to vote, and of her pride in me. However the world saw and measured her, she was a woman of courage and vision. And her service was recognized at the end of her life. She was buried with military honors. The flag that flew over West Point in 2013 to mark my retirement had draped her casket 20 years before. And she is anonymous in that her name is not known to you. But her name is known to me, and her life and her service are woven into and through my own. I've had a career and opportunities that my grandmother only dreamed of having. And with that comes the responsibility to yield the stage with as much grace as I can manage after the privilege of serving my country. I have been lifted through this transition by what I understand about the purposeful anonymity of a leader. I've had time in the last year to think of the nuances between invisibility and anonymity, and those nuances are similar to those between success and achievement. And understanding this has freed me from my past successes without requiring me to deny my achievements. My successes, the way the world keeps score, will be forgotten. My achievements, where I know that I gave the very best that I had to give, cannot be erased, because achievements leave tracks of inspiration that allow others to make better time and go farther in their own journeys. We will all be eclipsed by those we lead, and that's the way it should be if we do it right. Leaders develop other leaders. At the beginning, you step onto the stage alone, and you get used to how that feels. And at the end, you step off the stage alone. The men and women that I led remained on the stage and stepped into the spotlight. I began a new journey with a large part of my ego and identity left behind. What I understand now about the purposeful anonymity of a leader has helped me through that transition, has helped me get used to how that feels. And it's made me understand that we can never barter our egos for the well-being of those who come after us. Coming to terms with this has not been a linear process for me. It pierces the heart of who I am. But I can tell you that in surrendering pieces of my ego, I remain connected to others. I have meaning, whether or not I'm visible or my name is known. And in a wonderful alchemy, what I've given away has given me stability, from which I can view the world around me and in front of me. If we're willing to hold our past identities with more affection than desperate attachment, if we're willing to lead with authenticity and accountability and finally anonymity, we are rewarded with the freedom and the courage to rally our talents one more time for the way ahead. Thank you.